Diane Quinn, 33 years old, and somehow still dealing with the people who stole my life. At a massive corporate gala, I ran into my ex-fiancé and my former best friend. He waved his VIP pass in my face like a trophy. "You were not invited," he smirked, looking me up and down. I did not argue. I just handed my solid black metal invitation to the receptionist. She scanned the code, froze completely, and frantically grabbed her radio to call the billionaire chairman of the event. "Sir," she gasped. "She is here." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had the ultimate revenge on people who tried to destroy your future. The grand lobby of the Waldorf Astoria hummed with the quiet, expensive energy of the corporate elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the polished marble floors, illuminating the hundreds of executives gathered for the tech industry event of the year. I stood near the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. It was deliberately unbranded, devoid of any flashy logos or ostentatious displays of wealth. I preferred flying under the radar. Being invisible makes the eventual execution so much sweeter. Tonight was the night Vanguard Holdings was scheduled to acquire a rising tech startup for $50 million. What nobody in that glittering, crowded room knew was that I held the strings to the entire operation. I was savoring the quiet anticipation when the harsh nasal laugh of a woman cut through the ambient noise of clinking champagne glasses. I turned slowly and saw them. Preston and Sydney. 4 years ago, Preston was the man I was going to marry. We built a startup together from the ground up in a tiny, cramped garage. I wrote the core algorithm, pouring my sweat, tears, and intellect into the code, while he handled the external sales pitches. Then he stole my intellectual property, pushed me out of my own company through a massive legal loophole, and took my best friend Sydney with him. She was supposed to be my maid of honor. Instead, she became his wife. Now they were walking toward me like royalty. Preston wore a custom velvet suit that screamed new money and desperation. Sydney clung tightly to his arm, draped in a heavily sequined silk gown and dripping with diamonds. The irony was not lost on me. Every jewel on her neck, every stitch of clothing they wore was bought with my stolen equity. Preston spotted me standing near the velvet security ropes, and his confident stride faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened in genuine shock before his face twisted into a smug, victorious grin. He practically dragged Sydney over to me, eager to display his dominance. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the woodwork," Preston sneered loudly, drawing the attention of a few nearby investors. "Did you get lost on your way to a temp agency, Quinn? Or are you here to serve drinks?" Sydney giggled, a high and grating sound that made my jaw clench. She looked me up and down, her eyes stopping mockingly at my plain suit. "Oh, Preston, leave her alone. Look at her outfit, not even a single designer label. It is honestly just sad. You would think after 4 years she would have figured out how to dress for a high society venue." I looked at them, taking in their arrogant posture and their hollow, fragile confidence. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. Reacting emotionally is exactly what they wanted. It was the same exact tactic they used 4 years ago to paint me as unstable so they could justify stealing my company. Instead, I maintained absolute, unwavering eye contact and offered a slow, chilling smile. My total silence seemed to unnerve Preston. He puffed out his chest, his face flushing red, and grabbed the heavy gold VIP lanyard hanging around his neck. He shook the pass in front of my face like a toy. "This is a closed corporate event, Quinn. Tonight, my company is being acquired for $50 million. I am the guest of honor. You were not invited. If you take one single step toward that ballroom, I will personally have security throw you out on the street where you belong." I stepped around him without uttering a single word. The main check-in desk was flanked by 2 massive security guards. The receptionist, a young woman visibly overwhelmed by the constant stream of demanding tech executives, looked up as I approached. Preston and Sydney followed right behind me, practically vibrating with excitement as they eagerly waited for my public humiliation. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a solid black tungsten card. There was no name printed on it, no company logo, only an embedded gold microchip. I placed the heavy metal card onto the marble counter. It landed with a solid thud. The receptionist picked it up with a polite but highly dismissive smile. "I am sorry, ma'am, but if you do not have a registered QR code on your phone, I cannot let you inside." Her voice completely died in her throat as she tapped the heavy card against the scanner. The computer screen did not just flash green to grant entry. It flashed a solid, glowing red sequence with a security clearance level reserved exclusively for the absolute top of the corporate food chain. The screen proudly displayed the words, "Majority Shareholder." The color completely drained from the receptionist's face. She stared at the monitor, reading the classified designation, and then slowly raised her terrified eyes to look at me. Her hands began to shake violently. She dropped the tungsten card on the desk, as if it physically burned her skin. Preston crossed his arms and laughed a loud, barking laugh. "See, I told you. They are going to call the cops on you for trespassing. Get your phone out, Sydney. I want a high-definition video of her getting dragged out of here in handcuffs." The receptionist ignored Preston entirely. She lunged for her security radio, her fingers fumbling desperately with the call button. "Mr. Hastings." She gasped into the microphone, her voice trembling with sheer panic. "Sir, please come to the front desk immediately. She is here." Preston smirked, looking incredibly proud of himself. "Wow, you really messed up this time, Quinn. Gregory Hastings is the billionaire chairman of Vanguard Holdings. He is the man handing me a $50 million check tonight. When he sees a pathetic, jealous ex trying to crash his private event, he is going to absolutely ruin you." I kept my posture perfectly relaxed and composed. Preston had absolutely no idea that Gregory Hastings, the terrifying and ruthless titan of finance, only answered to one person in this world, and that person was standing right in front of him. I waited for Gregory to emerge from the crowded, noisy ballroom. But before the silver-haired chairman could reach the front desk to properly greet me, a harsh, abrasive voice echoed across the marble floor from the opposite direction. It was a voice that immediately made my blood run cold. Heavy, aggressive footsteps marched toward my position. My toxic blood relatives had spotted me, and they were charging forward, ready to deliver the next blow. "What are you doing here?" The sharp, heavily manicured fingers of my mother Patricia dug instantly into my forearm. I did not flinch. I simply looked down at her hand until she uncomfortably released her grip. My father Thomas and my older brother Mitchell flanked her like two utterly useless bodyguards. They all wore the same expression of panicked embarrassment, completely terrified that my mere presence would somehow ruin their proximity to wealth. "You need to leave right now." Patricia hissed, her voice a frantic whisper, meant to avoid drawing attention from the surrounding investors. "We told you specifically to stay away. Today is Preston's big day. He is signing a $50 million deal, and the last thing he needs is you causing another one of your psychotic scenes." I smoothed the fabric of my sleeve exactly where her claws had just been. "A scene," I repeated softly. "You mean like the scene where I discovered my fiancé in bed with my best friend? Or the scene where my own family helped him steal my life's work?" My father stepped forward, his face turning a dark shade of red. He puffed out his chest, trying to project an authority he had not earned in decades. "You had a mental breakdown 4 years ago, Quinn. You were completely unstable. Preston had every legal right to fire you from that startup. He built this tech company with his own 2 hands. You were just holding him back." The sheer audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. I looked at Thomas, the man who was supposed to protect me, and felt absolutely nothing but clinical disgust. He built nothing. I stated, my voice dropping to a register so cold and authoritative that even Mitchell took a step back. "I wrote every single line of the proprietary machine learning model in our apartment, while Preston was out buying overpriced drinks on my credit card. He did not even know how to open a command terminal. He committed corporate espionage, stole my source code, and transferred the intellectual property to a newly formed LLC. And when I went to you for help, my own father, what did you do?" Thomas opened his mouth to argue, but I did not give him the chance to spin another lie. "You gaslit me," I continued, making direct eye contact with my parents. "You and Patricia cornered me in a hospital room after I collapsed from severe burnout. I was physically and mentally drained from coding a platform that was ready for a Series A funding round. You manipulated me into signing a separation agreement and forfeiting my fully vested shares under the guise of keeping the peace. You convinced me that surrendering my equity was the only way to protect the family from a lengthy public legal battle. But we all know the real reason, do we not? I shifted my gaze to Mitchell, who was sweating visibly under the bright chandelier lights. Preston promised you a seat on the board of directors, Thomas, I said, laying the corporate reality bare. He bought your loyalty with a worthless title and a fraction of a percent in phantom equity. You traded your daughter's future so you could brag to your golf buddies about being a tech executive. Sydney, sensing the shift in power, desperately grabbed Preston's arm. Do not listen to her, babe. She is just a bitter, unemployed dropout who cannot handle that we won. Mitchell finally found his voice, stepping up next to Preston like a loyal lapdog. You heard her, Quinn. You are pathetic. Preston is about to be a multi-millionaire, and you are crashing a corporate gala in a cheap suit just to beg for attention. Walk out that door before you embarrass yourself even more. I looked at my brother, 36 years old, utterly devoid of any actual business skills, currently wearing a suit I knew he had bought on a high-interest credit card. He was begging for scraps from the man who had ruined his sister. The pathetic nature of his existence was almost painful to witness. I am not the one who should be embarrassed, Mitchell, I said smoothly. You might want to check the fine print on that board seat Thomas was promised. Or the Vice President of Human Resources title you have been begging Preston to give you. Equity in a stolen company is still stolen property. Preston's arrogant smirk returned in full force. He had realized that arguing with me was drawing the eyes of passing venture capitalists. He decided to play the powerful executive shutting down a nuisance. This is completely ridiculous, Preston announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the nearby check-in desk. I am not going to let a disgruntled ex-employee ruin the most important night of my career. He turned his back on me completely and raised his hand high in the air, snapping his fingers toward the main entrance doors. Two massive security guards dressed in dark tactical suits immediately caught his signal. Preston pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. Gentlemen. Preston commanded, his voice dripping with absolute superiority. This woman is trespassing at a private corporate acquisition event. She has a documented history of severe mental instability and is currently harassing my family. Remove her from the premises immediately. Use physical force if you have to. Patricia let out a dramatic sigh of relief, patting her perfectly styled hair. Thank goodness. Let the professionals handle her. Thomas sneered at me one last time. You brought this on yourself, Quinn. You always do. The security guards marched forward, their heavy boots echoing on the polished marble floor. They flanked me on both sides, their expressions hard and unyielding. The taller of the two reached out his massive hands, preparing to grab my shoulders and physically drag me out of the Waldorf Astoria. The entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my public humiliation to reach its devastating climax. Preston crossed his arms, his chest puffed out in total triumph, eagerly waiting for the show. Before the guard's heavy hand could clamp down on my shoulder, a sharp, commanding voice sliced through the heavy tension of the lobby. Do not even think about touching her. A figure stepped smoothly into the narrow space between me and the tactical security team. It was Nia, my brother's wife. At 34 years old, Nia was a striking African-American woman with a brilliant legal mind, currently wearing a tailored emerald pantsuit that made Sydney's sequenced gown look like a cheap costume. Nia had spent the last 4 years quietly observing the parasitic nature of the family she had married into, and clearly she had reached her absolute limit. She had built her own career in corporate auditing. She knew how to read a balance sheet, and more importantly, she knew how to read people. Nia stood her ground, her posture immaculate, projecting an authority that made the two massive guards hesitate. She stared them down for a fraction of a second before turning her lethal, unyielding gaze directly onto my brother and my mother. She owns the original patent, Mitchell, Nia stated, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity. Every single line of code keeping that startup afloat belongs to her, Back off, both of you. Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical outrage. Nia, what on earth is wrong with you? Whose side are you on? You are supposed to be supporting this family. Mitchell turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his tightly knotted collar. He lunged forward, grabbing Nia by the elbow and attempting to yank her out of the way. She yanked her arm back with equal force, her eyes flashing with pure warning. "Shut your mouth," Nia, Mitchell hissed, his voice dropping into a vicious, controlling tone meant to intimidate her. "Know your place. You are embarrassing me in front of Preston. Step out of the way right now before you ruin my career." Nia did not flinch. She simply looked at the man she had married with profound, icy disgust. "What career, Mitchell? You do not have a career. You are a glorified errand boy begging for handouts from a thief." Preston, infuriated that his grand display of power was being interrupted by my sister-in-law, snapped his fingers at the security team again. He completely ignored Nia's warning. "I do not care what his wife says," Preston barked, his face twisting with arrogant impatience. "This woman is a security threat. I want her removed from the Waldorf Astoria right now. Do your jobs." The guards, taking their direct orders from the VIP guest of honor, nodded in agreement. The taller guard stepped around Nia, his massive hands lunging forward to grab me by the arms and physically drag me toward the revolving glass doors. I did not brace for impact. I did not step back. I kept my eyes locked on Preston. I said, "Take your hands off her immediately." The command thundered across the marble floor. It was not a shout, but a booming, gravelly voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute corporate authority. The crowd of wealthy investors parted like the Red Sea. Chairman Gregory Hastings, a silver-haired titan of the financial industry, dressed in a bespoke navy suit, marched directly into the center of the conflict. He did not ask for permission to intervene. He simply stepped forward and forcefully shoved the taller security guard's arm away from me. The guards froze instantly. Every single executive investor and hotel staff member in the lobby recognized the billionaire founder of Vanguard Holdings. The air in the room grew completely still. Preston's face immediately lit up with an eager, fawning expression. He assumed Gregory had rushed over to protect his $50 million investment from a crazy stalker. Preston quickly stepped around my parents, smoothing his velvet jacket, and extended his hand toward the billionaire with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Gregory Sir Preston," said, his voice dripping with sycophantic charm, "I am so incredibly sorry about this minor disturbance. You did not need to come down here yourself. This unstable woman was just leaving. Security is handling it." Gregory Hastings did not shake Preston's hand. He did not even look at Preston. He looked straight through him as if the man were completely invisible. The billionaire chairman adjusted his suit jacket, stepped squarely in front of me, and then did something that caused the entire lobby to stop breathing. Gregory lowered his head and offered me a deep, highly respectful bow. "My deepest apologies for the wait, ma'am," Gregory said, his tone entirely deferential. "The board of directors was reviewing the final restructuring protocols you requested for tonight's acquisition. We are fully prepared to proceed on your command." The silence that blanketed the lobby was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Preston's eager smile shattered into a million pieces. His extended hand dropped awkwardly to his side. His jaw unhinged, his eyes darting frantically between my perfectly stoic face and the bowing billionaire. The cognitive dissonance was breaking his mind in real time. He tried to process what he was seeing, but his brain completely short-circuited. Sydney let out a confused, high-pitched gasp, clutching her diamond necklace, as if she were suddenly struggling for air. Thomas and Patricia stared at Gregory with blank, uncomprehending expressions. Mitchell looked as though the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. The man holding the $50 million check, the ruthless titan of corporate acquisitions, the billionaire they had all been worshipping, had just bowed to the unemployed failure they discarded 4 years ago. Preston swallowed hard, his face turning an ashen shade of gray as the horrifying reality began to set in. How on earth did I know the billionaire who was buying his company? For 3 agonizing seconds, Preston stared at Gregory Hastings' bowed head. You could practically hear the rusty gears turning inside his brain as his fragile ego desperately fought to reject the reality unfolding right in front of him. Narcissists possess a truly fascinating survival mechanism. When confronted with a truth that shatters their superiority, their brains instantly rewrite the narrative to protect their delusion. Preston's breathing steadied. The color rushed back into his cheeks. He let out a sudden booming laugh that echoed awkwardly across the polished marble lobby. He clapped his hands together, his face twisting into an expression of patronizing amusement. "Oh, I get it now," Preston announced, his voice dripping with loud condescension. "You are the event coordinator. Vanguard hired you to run the logistics for the gala tonight." Preston turned to the crowd of gathered investors, grinning widely like a man who had just solved a simple riddle. "Of course. Restructuring protocols. You mean the seating charts and the catering schedule?" "Wow, Quinn. I have to admit, organizing hotel banquets is definitely a step up from being unemployed." "Good for you." I did not correct him. I stood perfectly still, my expression an impenetrable mask of calm. Preston grew bolder, fueled entirely by my silence. He actually stepped past me and clapped his hand heavily onto Gregory Hastings' shoulder. It was a staggering display of disrespect, treating a 60-year-old financial titan like a fraternity brother at a sports bar. "Gregory," Sir Preston said, flashing his perfectly bleached teeth, "it is incredibly generous of Vanguard Holdings to hire struggling locals for these events. We love seeing corporate charity in action, but let us not waste your valuable time on the hired help. We have a $50 million acquisition to sign tonight, and I know you want to get the champagne flowing just as much as I do." Behind him, my family eagerly fed off his manufactured confidence. My brother Mitchell smirked, stepping forward to piggyback on Preston's dominance. "Make sure my steak is cooked medium rare tonight, Quinn," Mitchell sneered. "And try not to drop any plates when the executives are talking." My mother, Patricia, let out a dramatic sigh of relief, clearly thrilled that the narrative had been restored to her liking. "Just do your job quietly, Quinn, and please do not mess up the floral arrangements on our table. We have very important people to impress tonight." They were all so blinded by greed and their desperate need to feel superior that they completely ignored the glaring, undeniable reality right in front of them. Billionaires do not bow to party planners. Sydney, emboldened by her husband's delusions, strutted forward. She smoothed the fabric of her sequined gown and stepped directly into my personal space. The scent of her expensive, overpowering perfume washed over me. She raised her left hand deliberately, waving it directly in my line of sight. A massive, flawless diamond ring caught the light of the grand chandeliers. I recognized the exact valuation of that stone. It was purchased directly with the stolen capital from the Series seed funding round. That was capital generated exclusively by the machine learning algorithm I coded from scratch, in a freezing, cramped apartment, while Sydney was pretending to be my supportive best friend. "It really is a shame," Sydney cooed, her voice laced with fake sympathy. "You were always so good at typing away in the dark, but you just never had the mindset for real business. Too bad you lacked the vision to scale the company. If you had just listened to Preston 4 years ago, maybe you would not be stuck planning parties while we are cashing out for $50 million. I looked at the diamond ring, then slowly traced my gaze up into Sydney's eyes. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of the rage they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply let them dig their graves deeper, watching them shovel the dirt over their own heads with enthusiastic pride. My total stoicism seemed to infuriate Sydney. She wanted me to scream, she wanted me to cry, to break down, and to validate her victory. My silence was a titanium wall she could not break. Gregory Hastings stood rigidly next to me. The Vanguard chairman was a man who routinely dismantled Fortune 500 companies before breakfast. He oversaw trillions in assets and commanded armies of corporate litigators. He watched Preston's display of astronomical stupidity with a look of pure, unfiltered pity. It was the exact look a seasoned predator gives a very loud, very oblivious prey wandering into a trap. Gregory slowly turned his head to look at Preston's hand, which was still resting presumptuously on his expensive suit jacket. He did not shrug it off. He simply stared at the hand until Preston, suddenly feeling the freezing temperature of the chairman's gaze, awkwardly pulled his fingers away and cleared his throat. Gregory took a deep breath, his broad chest expanding as he prepared to speak. I knew exactly what he was about to do. He was opening his mouth to absolutely decimate Preston's worldview, to strip away the pathetic delusion, and to introduce my true corporate title to the entire lobby. He was going to end the game right here and now. I shifted my gaze to catch Gregory's eye. Before a single syllable could leave the chairman's lips, I raised my right hand just a fraction of an inch and lifted a single finger. It was a subtle commanding gesture, a silent, absolute order to stand down. Gregory saw the movement. His jaw snapped shut instantly. He swallowed his words, gave a minuscule nod of obedience, and stepped back into a neutral, submissive posture. I lowered my hand, my face betraying absolutely nothing. Let them play. The higher they climb their imaginary pedestal tonight, the harder they will hit the concrete when I pull the financial foundation out from under them. Preston turned on his heel, dismissing me entirely, and led his entourage toward the frosted glass doors of the VIP cocktail lounge. Sydney clung to him, casting one final triumphant glance over her shoulder. My parents and Mitchell trailed behind them like eager ducklings hoping for breadcrumbs. I watched them disappear into the exclusive enclave, their loud laughter cutting through the sophisticated hum of the lobby. Gregory stood perfectly still beside me, waiting for my instruction. Proceed with the schedule, I told him, keeping my voice low. Make them comfortable. Let them drink the most expensive champagne you have. I want them feeling completely invincible when the floor drops. Gregory gave a crisp nod, his eyes gleaming with the predatory anticipation of a veteran corporate raider. He turned and marched toward the main ballroom to prepare the slaughter. I adjusted my jacket and quietly slipped into the VIP lounge, sticking to the dimly lit perimeter. The VIP lounge was a masterclass in calculated opulence. Dark mahogany walls absorbed the ambient light, while a live jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets circulated with trays of caviar and crystal flutes. I found a strategic vantage point behind a massive marble pillar draped in shadows. It provided a perfect, unobstructed view of Preston's semi-private booth. I stood perfectly still, letting the darkness conceal me, and watched the pathetic display of my so-called family. Thomas and Patricia were practically vibrating with desperation. They leaned across the leather seating, hanging onto Preston's every word, as if he were a prophet delivering divine truth. Patricia kept reaching out to touch Sydney's arm, complimenting her dress, her hair, her jewelry, completely debasing herself for a scrap of validation. Thomas was no better. My father, a man who had spent his entire life demanding respect and absolute obedience from his children, was currently refilling Preston's glass, acting as a glorified butler for the man who had ruined his daughter. It was a sickening, fascinating study in human greed. They had traded their morality for proximity to wealth, and now they were actively worshipping the thief who held the purse strings. Then Mitchell made his move. He wiped his sweating palms on his trousers and leaned awkwardly across the table. His body language was a masterclass in submission. He hunched his shoulders, making himself physically smaller, a stark contrast to the arrogant bully he had been just 5 minutes ago in the lobby. "Preston, listen," Mitchell began, his voice strained with nervous desperation. "About the restructuring after the Vanguard buyout. We talked about the Vice President of Human Resources position. I just wanted to make sure we are still locked in for that. I have been putting in the groundwork, keeping everything quiet on my end, just like you asked." From my spot in the shadows, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I activated the camera, zoomed in slightly to frame the entire booth, and hit the red record button. The acoustics of the mahogany-paneled lounge carried their voices perfectly into my device. Preston slowly lowered his champagne flute. The charming, victorious smile melted off his face, replaced by a look of profound, unfiltered disgust. He stared at my brother as if Mitchell were a cockroach that had just crawled onto his expensive leather shoe. Mitchell Preston said, his tone flat and heavily laced with contempt. "You do not seriously think I am going to make you a vice president at a $50 million tech firm, do you?" Mitchell froze, his face draining of color. "But we had an agreement. I helped you handle Quinn 4 years ago. I secured the hardware. I did exactly what you told me to do. Preston scoffed, leaning back and spreading his arms across the booth. You stole a laptop from your own sister because you were broke and desperate. That does not make you an executive. That makes you a liability. When Vanguard takes over tomorrow, I'm going to have real investors scrutinizing my organizational chart. I cannot have a useless, underqualified hack sitting in the C-suite. Mitchell swallowed hard, looking frantically at our parents for support. Mom, Dad, tell him. We had a deal. I kept the camera steady, eager to capture my parents' defense of their golden boy, but the defense never came. Patricia set her drink down and shot Mitchell a warning glare. Mitchell, do not be greedy. Preston is under a lot of pressure with this acquisition. You cannot expect him to just hand out executive titles. Thomas nodded in rapid agreement, instantly siding with the money. Listen to your mother, Mitchell. You are embarrassing yourself. Preston has been more than generous to this family. You will take whatever position he finds appropriate. Mitchell looked absolutely gutted. His own parents had just thrown him under the bus without a second thought, sacrificing his dignity to keep Preston happy. Preston chuckled thoroughly, enjoying the complete subjugation of my family. Tell you what, Mitch. Because I am a generous guy, I will find a desk for you in the basement. You can manage the payroll for the janitorial staff. But you will take that desk, you will cash your modest paycheck, and you will keep your mouth completely shut about the past. Do we understand each other? Mitchell looked down at his lap, thoroughly humiliated, and gave a slow, defeated nod. Yes, I understand. I tapped the screen on my phone, saving the high-definition video directly to my secure cloud server. I had just recorded irrefutable, crystal-clear evidence of extortion, bribery, and complicity. Preston had just admitted to paying my brother for stolen hardware, and my parents had fully endorsed the corruption. It was the exact financial and legal ammunition my corporate litigators needed to ensure none of them would ever see the outside of a federal courtroom. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, savoring the cold, heavy weight of the evidence. Before I could step away from the marble pillar, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure detached itself from the crowded bar area and walked purposefully into the dimly lit alcove where I stood. It was Nia. She stepped into the shadows beside me, standing shoulder to shoulder with me in the dark. She did not look at the booth where her husband was currently drinking away his last shred of self-respect. She looked straight ahead. Her posture was rigid and her knuckles were turning white from how tightly she was gripping her designer clutch purse against her chest. I did not turn my head to look at Nia. In a room full of corporate sharks and desperate social climbers, two women having a quiet conversation in the shadows would instantly draw unwanted attention. We stood shoulder to shoulder, our eyes fixed firmly forward on the illuminated booth where my brother was currently drowning his remaining pride in a glass of expensive champagne. I cannot stomach another minute watching that man beg for his own dignity, Nia said. Her voice was a low, steady murmur, pitched perfectly, so that only I could hear the absolute venom lacing her words. Nia shifted her weight, the emerald silk of her tailored suit rustling softly against the marble pillar. I have spent 4 years married to a coward Quinn. 4 years of listening to Mitchell scream at me behind closed doors to inflate his own pathetic ego, only to watch him grovel like a beaten dog the second Preston snaps his fingers. I am entirely done with this marriage, and I am entirely done with the collective delusion keeping this toxic family afloat. I kept my gaze locked on the booth. Mitchell was now eagerly nodding along to whatever degrading instruction Preston was barking at him. You are a brilliant corporate auditor, Nia, I replied smoothly, my tone conversational but layered with deep respect. You always possess too much intellect and far too much class to remain chained to a sinking ship. I assumed you would formulate an exit strategy eventually. I just did not realize your timeline aligned so perfectly with mine. Nia let out a breath that sounded remarkably like a bitter laugh. Oh, my timeline accelerated the moment I found out what they actually did to you 4 years ago. Mitchell likes to drink when he feels inadequate, and when Mitchell drinks, he brags. He thought he was a criminal mastermind. He thought he was playing the corporate game. But he is sloppy, Quinn. He is incredibly, fatally sloppy. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Nia unfasten the gold clasp of her designer clutch. She did not pull out a compact mirror or a tube of lipstick. She reached in with 2 fingers and extracted a small, heavy, encrypted titanium USB drive. She pressed her hand flat against the side of her leg, hiding the drive from the view of the open lounge. I casually lowered my left hand, allowing my fingers to brush against hers. The cold metal of the drive slid seamlessly from her palm into mine. I curled my fingers around it, slipping it instantly into the concealed interior pocket of my charcoal jacket. Mitchell kept backups, Nia whispered, delivering the fatal blow with the precision of a seasoned sniper. Everything Preston paid him to steal from your laptop 4 years ago is on that drive. The original source code, the timestamped, commit logs, and the proprietary machine learning models. The digital fingerprints are irrefutable. You can prove you are the sole architect of the entire platform. A surge of cold, calculating adrenaline flooded my veins. My family had burned my life to the ground on the assumption that I had zero proof of my intellectual property. They assumed the laptop Mitchell stole and handed over to Preston was the only existing record of my work. They were fools. But that is not the best part. Nia continued, her voice practically humming with lethal satisfaction. Preston has been using Mitchell to route unauthorized capital through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Preston needed a proxy to sign the wire transfers so his own name would remain off the banking ledgers. He paid my husband a miserable sum to take on all the federal liability. Mitchell thought keeping a record of those transactions would give him leverage to negotiate his promotion. He was trying to blackmail a thief, I noted, a sharp smile finally breaking across my face. Exactly, Nia said. But Mitchell lacks the spine to actually pull the trigger. He gathered all the evidence of Preston embezzling millions in research and development funds, and then he just sat on it hoping Preston would magically reward him out of the goodness of his heart. The drive in your pocket contains every single offshore account routing number, every falsified invoice, and a complete audit trail of the stolen venture capital. You are handing me the executioner's axe, Nia. Nia finally turned her head to look directly at me. Her dark eyes were blazing with a fierce, uncompromising fire. Swing it hard, Quinn. I want to watch them burn. I want every single one of them to face the absolute ruin they deserve. I offered her a singular, profound nod. Consider it done. A heavy, resounding chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system of the VIP lounge, cutting our conversation short. The live jazz quartet immediately ceased playing. Across the room, the massive brass-studded mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open simultaneously. A wave of golden light and the swelling sound of a live orchestra flooded the lounge. Ladies and gentlemen, a polished voice announced over the intercom, "The banquet is now beginning. Please make your way to the main ballroom for the evening's keynote presentation and dinner service." The lounge immediately buzzed with energetic movement. Tech executives, venture capitalists, and eager social climbers began funneling toward the glowing entrance. I watched as Preston stood up from his booth, buttoning his velvet jacket with a look of supreme arrogant triumph. He offered his arm to Sydney, who preened and adjusted her diamond necklace for the watching crowd. My parents and Mitchell scrambled out of the booth right behind them, desperate to stay within the golden aura of Preston's perceived wealth. As Preston walked toward the ballroom doors, he pulled his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen, his thumbs moving rapidly. A cruel, malicious smirk twisted his features. He hit send and shoved the phone back into his jacket, laughing to himself as he guided Sydney into the grand hall. A second later, my phone vibrated intensely against my ribcage. I pulled it from my pocket and glanced at the illuminated screen. It was a notification from the family group chat. Preston had just sent a message to Thomas, Patricia, Mitchell, and me. I tapped the screen, opening the message thread. Preston had written a masterpiece of pathetic arrogance. "Look at the failure hiding in the shadows while we sit at the head table. Do not worry, Quinn. Once I sign this $50 million check on stage tonight, I am going to buy you a tent. I will have security escort you to the nearest homeless shelter before dessert is served. Enjoy the view from the cheap seats." Right below his message, 2 new notifications popped up instantly. Thomas liked the message. Patricia loved the message. I stared at the glowing screen. The absolute lack of basic human decency was no longer painful. It was just validation. Every shred of guilt I might have harbored about destroying their lives evaporated into the cold, conditioned air of the hotel. I locked my phone, tapping it lightly against the titanium drive hidden in my pocket. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. The prey was marching happily into the slaughterhouse. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, as I walked toward the grand ballroom doors, ready to begin the execution. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was a spectacle of corporate excess. Thousands of crystal prisms refracted the light above 50 circular tables, draped in crisp white silk. Instead of descending onto the main floor to join the herd of venture capitalists and tech executives, I caught the eye of the head of security and gestured upward. He immediately unhooked a velvet rope, granting me access to the private mezzanine balcony. The elevated tier wrapped around the perimeter of the room, shrouded in darkness, and reserved strictly for technical staff and security overwatch. It was the perfect vantage point. I took a seat in a high-backed leather chair, right at the balcony edge, completely veiled by the shadows, yet afforded a panoramic view of the slaughterhouse floor below. Directly in the center of the room sat Preston. His table was positioned closest to the main stage, an undeniable mark of his supposed status as the guest of honor. He sat with his legs splayed wide, holding a glass of vintage champagne like a scepter. Sydney was draped over his shoulder, performing her role as the adoring wife for anyone glancing their way. Beside them, my parents and Mitchell looked like lottery winners who had not yet realized their ticket was counterfeit. Thomas was laughing loudly at a joke Preston made, while Patricia signaled a waiter to refill her glass. They were entirely intoxicated by the illusion of their own impending wealth. My phone vibrated against the sleek fabric of my slacks. I pulled it out and opened the family group chat. Preston had just hit send on his promised message. Look at the failure hiding in the rafters. Once I sign this $50 million check on stage tonight, I am going to buy you a tent. I will have security escort you to the nearest homeless shelter before dessert is served. Enjoy the view from the cheap seats. Right below the block of text, 2 notifications appeared in rapid succession. Thomas liked the message. Patricia loved the message. I stared at the screen, observing the digital footprints of their cruelty. There was no pain left, only a sterile clinical confirmation that executing this takedown was absolutely necessary. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the small table next to me. I opened my briefcase and extracted a thin encrypted tablet, booting it up with a biometric scan. I retrieved the heavy titanium drive Nia had slipped into my hand and plugged it directly into the secure port. The decryption software ran for a fraction of a second before a massive directory of hidden folders populated my screen. Mitchell had indeed been sloppy, but Preston had been criminally arrogant. I opened the primary ledger files, my eyes scanning the rows of financial data with the practiced efficiency of a veteran corporate auditor. The story the numbers told was far worse than simple intellectual property theft. Preston had not just stolen my machine learning algorithm to secure his initial funding. He had been systematically bleeding the company dry for years. I pulled up the routing numbers and cross-referenced them with the offshore accounts Nia had mentioned. It was blatant, undeniable federal wire fraud. Preston had been funneling millions of dollars from his research and development budget directly into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He used that stolen capital to fund his lavish lifestyle, paying for Sydney's luxury cars, extravagant vacations, and the massive diamond ring currently sitting on her finger. To mask the bleeding balance sheet, he had falsified revenue projections and forged user acquisition metrics. He was actively lying to his current investors and attempting to defraud Vanguard Holdings out of $50 million based on entirely fabricated financial health. I clicked open the signature logs. Mitchell had authorized every single one of those fraudulent offshore transfers. Preston had used my brother as the ultimate fall guy, ensuring Mitchell's digital fingerprints were all over the embezzlement. If the federal authorities ever audited the company, Mitchell would be the one facing decades in a federal penitentiary while Preston walked away with clean hands. My parents had sold their soul to a man who was actively framing their son for federal crimes. The sheer magnitude of their collective stupidity was staggering. I initiated a secure file transfer, uploading the entire contents of the drive directly to Vanguard Holdings' internal legal department and copying the Federal Fraud Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The data transmission completed with a silent, glowing confirmation on my screen. The trap was locked. The guillotine was raised. Below me, the ambient noise of the ballroom began to shift. The live orchestra concluded their set with a final soaring chord that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. The main chandeliers dimmed slowly, casting the audience into a hushed, expectant twilight, while the brilliant stage lights flared to life. The moment had arrived. A hush fell over the room as Chairman Gregory Hastings walked purposefully out from the wings and stepped up to the acrylic podium. The Vanguard billionaire adjusted the microphone, his expression completely unreadable. Down at the center table, Preston stood up. He buttoned his velvet suit jacket with a sharp, confident tug, his chest puffed out in absolute triumph. He flashed a brilliant, arrogant smile at Sydney, completely ready to walk up those steps and claim his $50 million coronation. The sharp feedback of the microphone echoed through the cavernous ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room. Conversations halted. Champagne flutes were carefully placed onto silk tablecloths. Gregory Hastings stood at the clear acrylic podium, looking out over the sea of tech elites, venture capitalists, and industry titans. His expression was a masterclass in corporate stoicism, betraying absolutely none of the carnage that was about to unfold. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gregory began, his deep, resonant voice filling the grand space. "Welcome to a defining evening for Vanguard Holdings. In the world of venture capital, we are constantly searching for innovation. We look for disruptive technology, unparalleled vision, and most importantly, absolute integrity. Tonight, we gathered here under the assumption that we had found exactly that. We came here to formalize the acquisition of a company that promised to reshape the landscape of machine learning." Down at the center table, Preston was practically glowing. He stood up, fully buttoning the center button of his custom velvet jacket with a sharp, arrogant tug. He looked down at Sydney, offering her a smug, victorious wink. Sydney beamed back at him, raising her glass in a silent toast. My parents, Thomas and Patricia, were clapping enthusiastically, their faces flushed with the thrill of impending wealth. Mitchell sat beside them, cheering for the man who was actively framing him for federal crimes. The sheer delusion radiating from their table was almost palpable. Preston did not wait to be officially called up. His ego demanded the spotlight. He stepped away from his table and began his triumphant march toward the main stage. He walked with the swagger of a conquering king, his chest puffed out, shoulders thrown back. He nodded to investors he passed, shaking a hand here, pointing a finger gun there. He was soaking in the applause, basking in the admiration of hundreds of powerful people who believed he was a self-made genius. From my vantage point in the dark mezzanine, I watched his coronation walk with absolute icy detachment. He looked so incredibly small from up here, a tiny, fragile man walking blindly into a steel trap. Gregory watched Preston approach the stage. The billionaire chairman did not smile. He simply waited as two impeccably dressed assistants walked out from the wings of the stage carrying a massive, oversized presentation check. The crisp, bold lettering on the board was impossible to miss. $50 million. The crowd erupted into a fresh wave of applause. Preston reached the base of the stage stairs, taking the steps two at a time. He approached Gregory, opening his arms wide as if expecting the billionaire chairman to embrace him like an equal. Preston reached out his manicured hands, extending to grasp the edge of the $50 million check. Then the atmosphere in the ballroom fundamentally shifted. Gregory Hastings did not hand over the check. Instead, his jaw tightened. His eyes grew cold and hard, stripping away the polite veneer of a gala host to reveal the ruthless corporate predator underneath. Gregory gripped the top edge of the presentation board and deliberately, forcefully lowered it until it rested on the stage floor, completely out of Preston's reach. Preston froze. His extended hands hovered awkwardly in the empty space between them. The confident, arrogant smile plastered across his face fractured. He let out a nervous, breathy chuckle, looking around the stage as if waiting for a punchline that was not coming. The applause in the ballroom died out rapidly, replaced by a sudden, heavy silence. Hundreds of highly trained executives sensed the shift in the room's energy. Something was profoundly wrong. Gregory leaned back into the microphone. His voice cut through the silent ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade. Before we finalize this acquisition, Gregory announced, his tone entirely devoid of warmth. Vanguard Holdings must defer to our true majority shareholder. We do not finalize capital transfers of this magnitude without the direct authorization of the person who actually built this empire. Preston shifted his weight, visibly sweating under the intense stage lights. Gregory, sir, I am not sure I understand. Preston stammered, his voice lacking the booming confidence he had wielded just moments ago in the lobby. We finalized the terms this morning. Gregory ignored him completely. He did not even turn his head to acknowledge Preston's presence. He kept his eyes locked on the crowd, his voice projecting absolute authority. The architect of our entire venture capital fund has a restructuring announcement. Gregory continued, his words ringing out like a judge delivering a sentence. We will proceed under her direct orders. Preston took a step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the Vanguard legal team seated near the front row. Down at the center table, Sydney lowered her champagne glass, the smug satisfaction draining from her face. Patricia and Thomas exchanged panicked glances, entirely unequipped to process a corporate disruption of this scale. Mitchell just stared at the stage, his mouth hanging slightly open. Who is he talking about? Preston muttered under his breath, looking wildly around the stage. There is no other shareholder. I own the company. I have the papers. Gregory stepped away from the podium. He raised his right hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the technical booth at the back of the hall. Instantly, the brilliant warm lights illuminating the main stage snapped off, plunging Preston into absolute darkness. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of executives. Preston stumbled backward in the pitch black, his voice echoing in panic as he demanded someone turn the lights back on. A heavy mechanical click sounded from the lighting rig high above the ballroom floor. A single blindingly bright spotlight pierced through the darkness. It did not hit the stage. It did not hit the center table. The beam of pure white light swept across the vaulted ceiling and snapped directly up to the dark mezzanine balcony. The spotlight hit me dead center. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, my legs elegantly crossed, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. The tailored charcoal suit absorbed the harsh light, making me look like a ghost that had just materialized to collect a debt. I looked down over the railing, staring directly into the terrified wide eyes of the man who had stolen my life. The silence in the Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was absolute. Thousands of attendees stopped breathing all at once. The live orchestra had long since lowered their instruments, and not a single crystal champagne flute clinked against the silk tablecloths. The sheer, crushing weight of the silence was deafening. I stood up from my leather chair on the mezzanine, taking my time. I slowly smoothed the lapels of my unbranded charcoal suit, ensuring every line was perfectly crisp. The spotlight operator tracked my every move, keeping the blinding beam of pure white light pinned directly on me as I stepped out of the shadows and approached the sweeping marble staircase that connected the balcony to the main floor. My heels struck the marble steps. Click, click, click. The sound echoed through the cavernous space like a metronome counting down the final seconds of Preston's corporate life. The crowd below parted organically, stepping aside to create a wide, unobstructed path from the base of the stairs all the way to the main stage. Hundreds of powerful investors, venture capitalists, and tech elites stared in stunned fascination. They did not know my name yet, but they fluently spoke the universal language of absolute authority. They knew raw power when they saw it walking toward them. On the stage, Preston's brain finally short-circuited. The delusion he had meticulously maintained for 4 years shattered under the oppressive weight of the spotlight. Panic consumed him entirely. He lunged forward, grabbing the microphone from the acrylic podium with shaking hands. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the metal stand. Security. Preston screamed, his voice cracking violently over the massive sound system. Get her out of here right now. She is a fired employee. She is a psychotic stalker. I want her arrested for trespassing. Down at the center table, Sydney clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting terror. The massive diamond ring on her finger caught the light, but she looked like a woman who had just realized she was standing on a landmine. My parents, Thomas and Patricia, remained frozen in their seats, utterly paralyzed by the sudden violent shift in their reality. Mitchell gripped the edge of the dining table, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, as he realized the man he had been begging for an executive job was currently having a very public, very unhinged meltdown. Only Nia sat perfectly upright, a cool, deeply satisfied smile playing across her face. I did not alter my pace. I did not flinch at his shouting. I kept my gaze locked directly onto Preston's sweating, desperate face. He was unraveling in front of the exact people he had spent months trying to impress. The billionaire investors in the front row exchanged deeply concerned glances. In the corporate world, emotional outbursts from a chief executive officer are a massive red flag. Preston was bleeding credibility with every word he screamed. "Do your jobs!" Preston shrieked, pointing wildly at the tactical security team positioned around the perimeter of the ballroom. "She is having another mental breakdown. She has been harassing my family. Throw her out on the street before she ruins this event." 4 heavy-set security guards immediately mobilized, marching briskly toward the front of the room. Their heavy boots thumped against the polished floor. Preston let out a loud, breathy laugh of relief, falsely assuming the cavalry was coming to save his $50 million deal. He wiped the heavy layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his velvet sleeve, frantically trying to compose his features and rebuild his shattered CEO persona for the watching crowd. But the guards did not look at me. They marched directly past my path, their eyes fixed firmly on the stage. I reached the bottom of the grand staircase. Chairman Gregory Hastings walked purposefully down the steps from the stage to meet me on the ballroom floor. The billionaire titan did not ask me to stop. He did not question my presence. Instead, Gregory extended his right hand toward me, offering his physical support with the utmost professional reverence. I accepted Gregory's hand and stepped up onto the stage. The crowd watched in captivated silence as the chairman of Vanguard Holdings personally escorted me to the center of the platform. The visual hierarchy was undeniable. Gregory was treating me with the exact level of deference a subordinate reserves for their absolute superior. Preston stood by the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He tried to speak to Gregory, reaching his hand out in a desperate plea for an explanation. But before a single word could form on his lips, the 4 security guards stepped onto the stage. They did not move toward me. They marched directly up to Preston. 2 guards flanked him on his left and 2 on his right. They crossed their massive arms, using their sheer physical bulk to force Preston to take several stumbling steps backward. They effectively boxed him into a corner, completely isolating him away from the acrylic podium and the $50 million presentation check. Preston looked at the guards, then at Gregory, and finally at me. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow, empty shell of a man. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. The reality of his situation had finally breached his impenetrable ego. He was not the guest of honor. He was the prey. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, taking my rightful place at the center of the stage. I looked down at the VIP table, making sure my parents, my brother, and Sydney had a perfect, unobstructed view of my face. I wanted them to see exactly who held the executioner's axe. I reached out and tapped the microphone with my index finger. A sharp, clear thud resonated through the silent ballroom, demanding total submission from everyone in the room. I leaned forward, keeping my voice dangerously calm and entirely level. I was not fired, Preston. I was preparing. 4 years ago, the man trembling in the corner of this stage told the world a very compelling story. My voice echoed through the massive ballroom, crisp and completely devoid of emotion. He told our investors that I was unstable. He told the board that I was a liability. He told my own parents that for this technology to survive, the actual creator needed to be excised like an infection. I looked down at the center table. Thomas and Patricia were staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Mitchell sat frozen beside them, his jaw practically resting on his chest. You all bought his narrative because it was convenient. I continued my gaze sweeping over the audience of elite venture capitalists and industry titans. You looked at a quiet, dedicated coder and decided she was expendable. You allowed a charismatic thief to forge separation agreements and strip away my founder equity. You thought that because I walked away without screaming, without causing a public spectacle, I had simply surrendered. You thought I crawled into a hole to disappear. I gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium. I did not disappear. I adapted. Preston strained against the two massive security guards blocking his path. He looked like a trapped animal, his custom velvet suit clinging to his profusely sweating frame. "Quinn, shut your mouth!" he hissed, his voice raspy and panicked. "You have no idea what you are doing. You are ruining a $50 million acquisition." "I am not ruining anything, Preston," I replied smoothly. "I am executing an audit." A murmur of confusion rippled through the front rows of the audience. Wealthy executives shifted in their seats, exchanging wary glances. Gregory Hastings stood perfectly still at the edge of the stage, his hands clasped behind his back, watching me work with absolute, unwavering respect. "You spent the last 4 years chasing venture capital." "Preston?" I announced, projecting my voice so every single person in the grand hall could hear the undeniable truth. "You courted major investors, hosted extravagant dinners, and begged for constant cash injections to keep your stolen ship afloat because you had absolutely no idea how to update or maintain the core algorithm I wrote. You were bleeding money. Your operational costs were astronomical, and your revenue projections were entirely fabricated." Preston shook his head violently. "That is a lie. We are highly profitable." "You were weeks away from total insolvency," I corrected, silencing him instantly. "But then a miracle happened for you. Vanguard Holdings, an aggressive, highly secretive titan of industry, took a sudden interest in your little startup. They offered you an acquisition deal that seemed almost too good to be true. You thought you had finally made it to the big leagues. You thought a faceless conglomerate was stepping in to fund your luxury cars, your designer wardrobes, and your high society lifestyle." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the room. I looked directly into Preston's eyes, watching the absolute horror begin to dawn in his pupils. "You thought Vanguard was a faceless conglomerate funding your lifestyle?" I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp register. "I am Vanguard." The collective gasp from the ballroom was audible. Down at the center table, Sydney physically recoiled, pressing her hands against the sides of her face as if trying to block out the sound of my voice. Thomas and Patricia looked as though the floor had just opened up beneath them to reveal a bottomless pit. "Vanguard Holdings did not exist when you threw me out on the street," I stated, the rhythm of my words hitting like calculated physical blows. "I built it from the ground up. I traded sleep for aggressive market strategy. I leveraged my other unreleased patents into a highly lucrative private equity firm. And once I possessed enough capital, I turned my attention entirely back to you." Preston staggered backward until his spine hit the stage wall. He looked like he was going to vomit. "Over the last 2 years, you took out massive high-interest loans to cover up your bleeding balance sheets." I continued, exposing his financial incompetence to his peers. "You thought you were borrowing from anonymous hedge funds and independent banking institutions. You were borrowing from me. I used an intricate network of proxy firms to systematically purchase every single piece of your financial obligations." I stepped out from behind the podium, walking slowly toward where the security guards held him pinned against the wall. "As of this morning, I hold 60% of your company's leveraged debt," I declared, closing the distance between us. "I am the sole majority shareholder. I am the bank holding the mortgage on your corporate headquarters. I am the entity that owns the patents, the infrastructure, and the payroll." Preston was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving under his expensive velvet jacket. He looked wildly at Gregory Hastings, begging the older billionaire for some sort of intervention, but Gregory simply offered him a cold, unsympathetic stare. I stopped just a few feet away from Preston. I looked at this pathetic, greedy man who had betrayed me, stolen my work, and convinced my own family to discard me like trash. The victory tasted metallic and absolute. I do not just own the algorithm you stole, I said, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute finality. I own you. A high-pitched, completely unhinged shriek tore through the silent ballroom. Down at the center table, Sydney violently shoved herself away from the dining arrangement. The reality of her situation had just shattered her fragile gold-digging mind. She was not married to a wealthy tech genius. She was married to a bankrupt fraud who was entirely at the mercy of the woman she had betrayed. The massive diamond ring on her finger suddenly represented nothing but suffocating debt. You ruined everything, Sydney screamed at the top of her lungs, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage and terror. She grabbed her crystal champagne flute from the table, her knuckles turning white. With a guttural sob of absolute despair, she hurled the heavy glass directly at the stage. It flew through the air, completely missing me, and smashed violently against the edge of the platform. The crystal shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces, the sound of breaking glass signaling the absolute and final destruction of their stolen empire. The sharp crash of crystal against the stage edge sent a spray of shimmering shards across the polished floorboards. A few drops of expensive champagne splattered against the toe of my leather pump. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I merely looked down at the broken glass, then slowly raised my eyes to the woman who had thrown it. Sydney was entirely unhinged. Her carefully curated high society persona had completely disintegrated. Her sequenced gown looked absurd as she frantically gripped the edge of the dining table, her chest heaving with ragged, panicked breaths. The massive diamond ring on her finger caught the harsh stage lighting, trembling violently as she pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do something!" Sydney shrieked, her voice cracking as she whipped her head toward my parents. "Thomas, Patricia, control your crazy daughter. Tell her to stop this right now. She is ruining my husband's company. Make her get off that stage." The sheer desperation in her voice echoed terribly in the cavernous room. The surrounding tech executives and venture capitalists stared at her with expressions of profound distaste. In their world, losing your composure was the ultimate cardinal sin. Sydney was loudly proving that she was nothing more than a fraud playing dress-up in a world she did not understand. I shifted my gaze to my parents. They did not move to comfort Sydney. They did not utter a single word in Preston's defense. Thomas and Patricia were frozen in their seats, utterly paralyzed by the crushing weight of their own monumental miscalculation. Thomas sat with his mouth hanging slightly open, his face completely drained of blood. His eyes darted from the Vanguard Holdings logo on the podium to my face, his brain desperately trying to process the impossible math. The daughter he had banished, the woman he had berated as a worthless failure, was a billionaire titan. She was the absolute apex predator of the financial food chain. Patricia clutched her linen napkin so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She was visibly shaking. The horrifying reality was sinking into her status-obsessed mind. She had sold out a billionaire daughter for a cheap, fraudulent counterfeit. She had traded a legitimate corporate empire for a few free dinners and a fake promise of a board seat. The absolute magnitude of their mistake was physically crushing them into silence. Beside them, Mitchell had shrunk down in his chair, trying to make himself invisible. Nia simply took a calm sip of her sparkling water, watching the implosion of her toxic in-laws with absolute regal serenity. I did not raise my voice to address Sydney's pathetic tantrum. True power does not shout over the noise, it orchestrates the silence. I raised my right hand into the glare of the spotlight and snapped my fingers. It was a single sharp sound that echoed across the dead, silent ballroom. At the back of the hall, the heavy brass-studded doors swung open simultaneously. A synchronized rhythm of purposeful footsteps flooded the room. A highly specialized team of 12 elite corporate litigators marched down the center aisle. They moved in perfect, intimidating formation. They wore razor-sharp bespoke suits and carried heavy, leather-bound briefcases. Their expressions were entirely devoid of warmth, possessing the cold, calculated efficiency of executioners reporting for duty. The crowd of wealthy investors instinctively parted for them, recognizing the undeniable presence of high-end legal warfare. The legal team marched directly past Preston's table, completely ignoring Sydney's ongoing hysteria. They lined up shoulder to shoulder at the base of the stage, creating an impenetrable, terrifying human wall of legal defense between me and the pathetic remnants of my former life. The lead attorney, a formidable woman with sharp features and a tailored navy suit, walked up the stage stairs. She bypassed Preston without a second glance, approached the podium, and handed me a thick, sealed red folder. "Everything is finalized. Miss Quinn," the lead attorney stated, her voice crisp and projecting perfectly through the nearby microphone. "The federal filings are active. We are ready to proceed with the asset seizure." "Thank you, counselor," I replied smoothly. I placed the red folder onto the clear acrylic podium and turned my attention back to the encrypted tablet resting on its surface. I looked down at Preston. He was still pinned against the wall by the security guards, hyperventilating as he watched the army of lawyers surround the stage. His eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror. "Preston," I announced, my voice washing over the breathless crowd. "You built a house of cards on a stolen foundation, and you convinced everyone in this room that it was an impenetrable fortress. You thought you could hide your incompetence behind flashy presentations and fabricated revenue metrics. But unfortunately for you, I brought the original blueprints." I tapped a single key on my secure tablet. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage, the ones previously displaying Vanguard Holdings' glowing logo, instantly snapped to black. A collective murmur of anticipation rippled through the audience of investors. A second later, a highly classified, heavily redacted financial document illuminated the ballroom, projecting massive, undeniable numbers for every single executive in the room to see. The digital audit laid bare the catastrophic reality of Preston's operation. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage illuminated the ballroom with the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute truth. Rows of accounting data, offshore banking ledgers, and wire transfer logs scrolled across the displays in high definition. I had instructed my legal team to highlight the most damning discrepancies in brilliant, unmistakable red ink. The visual impact was instantaneous and devastating. A wave of low, furious murmurs rolled through the audience. The hundreds of venture capitalists, angel investors, and tech executives seated in the grand hall were not fools. They were apex predators who knew exactly how to read a balance sheet. They could instantly see the catastrophic reality projected before them. The company they thought was an industry leader was actually a hollow, rotting carcass. I tapped the clear acrylic podium, drawing every eye in the room back to me. "You stood in this lobby an hour ago and bragged about your impending wealth," I said, my voice echoing with icy, calculated precision. "You tried to sell me a company for $50 million. You stood before this crowd and presented yourself as a visionary leader who had conquered the tech industry." I reached into my pocket and extracted the small, heavy titanium drive that Nia had handed me in the shadows of the VIP lounge. I held the encrypted device up to the glaring spotlight, ensuring everyone in the room could see the exact instrument of Preston's destruction. "But according to these files," I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal, razor-sharp register, "your real valuation is negative $12 million. Preston let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. He pressed his back harder against the stage wall, practically trying to phase through the solid material to escape the suffocating reality. The two security guards flanking him did not yield an inch. They stood like statues, ensuring he remained trapped in the glaring spotlight for his public execution. I tapped the secure tablet on the podium, advancing the presentation to the next slide. A detailed pie chart materialized on the massive screens behind me, breaking down the exact flow of the stolen venture capital. "For the last 4 years, you told your investors that your aggressive cash burn rate was entirely due to vital research and development," I announced, tearing away the final shreds of his corporate facade. "You claimed you were optimizing the machine learning algorithm. But that algorithm has not been updated a single time since the day you stole it from my laptop. It is entirely obsolete." I looked down at the center table. Sydney was trembling violently, her hands gripping the edge of the silk tablecloth so tightly her knuckles were translucent. The arrogant smirk she had worn all evening was completely eradicated. "Instead of funding innovation, you have been systematically embezzling corporate R&D funds," I stated, my voice ringing with total authority. "You routed millions of dollars of investor capital through shell companies in the Cayman Islands to fund your own desperate illusion of success. You used company money to pay for Sydney's Cartier bags, her imported luxury cars, and her heavily sequenced wardrobe. The crowd of wealthy investors turned their collective gaze towards Sydney. Dozens of furious, powerful executives glared at the woman dripping in diamonds purchased with their stolen money. Sydney physically shrank under the intense, venomous scrutiny. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, desperately trying to hide the massive diamond ring that now served as glaring physical evidence of federal wire fraud. But Sydney's extravagant shopping habits were only a fraction of the problem, I added, bringing my attention back to the sweating, terrified man trapped on my stage. I advanced the screen to the final, most damning document. It was a comprehensive ledger of international wire transfers, directed to illegal betting syndicates. You drained the remaining liquidity of this company to pay off your own massive offshore gambling debts, I declared. You lost millions of dollars chasing a high-roller lifestyle you could never legitimately afford. You are not a tech visionary, Preston. You are a degenerate gambler and a common thief who ran out of other people's money. Preston opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense. He looked wildly out at the audience, his eyes begging for a single friendly face. But there was no salvation to be found. The venture capitalists sitting in the front rows, the very men and women who had believed his lies and funded his fraudulent company, were glaring at him with pure, unfiltered hatred. These were ruthless financial titans who absolutely despised being made to look foolish. Preston had taken their capital, lied to their faces, and thrown their money away on sports bets and designer handbags. By exposing him tonight, I had not just destroyed his company, I had permanently blacklisted him from the entire financial sector. He would never secure a single cent of funding from anyone in this industry ever again. It was a misunderstanding. Preston stammered, his voice weak and pitifully thin. The acoustics of the ballroom caught his pathetic defense, broadcasting his cowardice to the entire room. The funds were temporarily relocated for tax purposes. I was going to replace the capital after the acquisition. You have to believe me. I am a legitimate CEO. A harsh, booming laugh erupted from the front row. A prominent billionaire investor shook his head in absolute disgust, turning his back on the stage entirely. The gesture sparked a domino effect. One by one, the elite executives in the audience crossed their arms, entirely rejecting the pathetic man sweating under the stage lights. Preston realized the game was over. His knees buckled slightly, his perfectly tailored velvet suit suddenly looking wrinkled and absurd. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, smearing sweat across his forehead. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest heaving as the absolute certainty of federal prison began to crush his chest. I watched his total humiliation with a profound sense of closure. The man who had caused me so much pain, who had so callously discarded me for his own greed, was entirely broken. But my financial autopsy was not quite finished. Preston was the architect of my misery, but he had not acted alone. He had required an inside man, a willing accomplice who had gladly sold out his own blood for a taste of corporate power. I let the silence hang over the ruined CEO for a few more seconds, ensuring the audience fully absorbed the magnitude of his fraud. Then I slowly shifted my gaze away from the stage and looked directly down at the center dining table. My parents were staring at Preston in abject horror, but my eyes bypassed them completely. I locked my cold, unrelenting gaze onto the man sitting beside them. My attention turned entirely to my brother Mitchell. Mitchell was sinking so low into his dining chair he practically merged with the upholstery. His face was slick with a cold sweat, his eyes darting frantically around the ballroom as if searching for a hidden exit. He had watched the man he worshipped get completely dismantled in under 5 minutes, and now the blinding beam of the spotlight had caught him in its devastating glare. "And Mitchell," I said, letting his name ring out through the grand sound system. The sharp clarity of my voice made him flinch physically. "What about the Vice President of Human Resources position you begged for in the VIP lounge tonight?" A fresh wave of whispers swept through the crowd of executives. Mitchell gripped the edge of the silk tablecloth, his knuckles turning white. He shook his head in a pathetic attempt at denial, but he lacked the courage to actually speak the words. "You sat in the dark and groveled for a title in a company you knew nothing about." I continued pacing slowly across the center of the stage. "But Preston was never going to give you an executive suite. He promised you a desk in the basement. Do you know why he treated you with such absolute contempt? Because Preston was paying you hush money. He was keeping you on a leash because you were the one who physically stole my hard drive 4 years ago. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of shocked murmurs. Corporate espionage executed by a family member was a scandal that even these ruthless venture capitalists found distasteful. Mitchell finally found a miserable fraction of his voice. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the polished floor. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure of 1,000 judging eyes. "You are crazy, Quinn. You lost that laptop yourself during one of your mental episodes. I never touched your things. Preston, tell them she is lying." He looked toward the stage, desperately pleading for his corrupt idol to save him. But Preston remained pinned against the stage wall by the security guards, completely unresponsive, his own life effectively over. I did not raise my voice to argue with a cornered rat. I simply tapped the screen of my secure tablet. The massive digital displays behind me instantly refreshed. The pie charts and offshore banking ledgers vanished, replaced by a series of highly classified financial documents. These were the internal payment authorizations from Preston's newly formed LLC, dated exactly 4 years ago, just days after I was forced out. I directed the audience's attention to the screens. If I lost the hardware myself, I asked smoothly, then why did Preston authorize a wire transfer of $200,000 to your personal bank account? Just 48 hours later, the documents, projected in brilliant high definition, displayed the exact routing numbers, the date stamps, and the payment memos listed vaguely as consulting fees. But the most damning piece of evidence was highlighted in a glowing red box at the bottom of the screen. Mitchell let out a strangled gasp. He stared up at the massive display, his eyes locked on his own digital signature authorizing the receipt of the stolen funds. "You sold your sister's life work for $200,000, I announced, ensuring the entire financial sector understood exactly what kind of man Mitchell was. "You facilitated the theft of my intellectual property, and you have been accepting continuous hush money payments routed through those offshore shell companies ever since. Your signature is on every single illegal transfer. You are an active accomplice to federal wire fraud." Mitchell collapsed back into his chair as if his legs had been violently kicked out from under him. He buried his face in his trembling hands. The absolute certainty of a federal indictment was crashing down on his shoulders. He had traded his family for dirty money, and now he was going to lose his freedom. At that exact moment, the woman sitting beside him decided she had seen enough. Nia stood up from the dining table. Her movements were remarkably calm, carrying an elegant, regal grace that contrasted sharply with the chaotic panic radiating from my parents and my brother. The emerald silk of her tailored suit caught the ambient light of the ballroom as she turned to look down at the pathetic, sweating man she had married. Mitchell looked up at her through his fingers. His eyes were wide with desperate, pleading terror. "Naya, please," he whimpered, reaching a shaking hand toward her. "Tell them this is a mistake. You are an auditor. You can fix the numbers. Help me." Naya did not reach back. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. She did not yell, nor did she make a scene. She simply reached for her left hand and gracefully slid the heavy diamond wedding ring off her finger. Mitchell watched her in mounting horror. "No, Nia, do not do this." Nia held the diamond ring over his half-full crystal glass of expensive champagne. She let go. The heavy piece of jewelry dropped into the glass with a sharp, distinct clink, sinking straight to the bottom and resting among the rising bubbles. "My lawyer filed the divorce papers at 9 o'clock this morning." Mitchell. Nia stated, her voice steady, cold, and carrying just enough volume to be heard by the surrounding tables. "I have already provided my own audit of your personal finances to the authorities. Have fun in federal prison." She picked up her designer clutch purse, turned her back on him completely, and began walking toward the main exit of the ballroom. She kept her head held incredibly high, her posture immaculate. The crowd of wealthy investors and industry titans actually parted for her, stepping aside with a profound level of respect for a woman who recognized a sinking ship and possessed the class to walk away from it like a queen. Mitchell let out a wretched, miserable sob, reaching his hands out toward his departing wife, but she never once looked back. With Mitchell utterly destroyed and Sydney hyperventilating at the center table, the brutal reality of the power dynamic finally penetrated the thick, status-obsessed skulls of my parents. Thomas and Patricia had spent the last 4 years groveling at Preston's feet because they believed he held the key to high society. They had enabled the abuse, gaslit me into signing away my rights, and continuously degraded my worth because they thought I was a powerless failure. But the colossal digital screens above the stage, the army of corporate litigators flanking me, and the absolute submission of Chairman Gregory Hastings told a completely different story. Vanguard Holdings was not buying Preston's company to make him rich. Vanguard Holdings was me taking back my empire. I possessed the billions. I held the ultimate authority. Greed is a remarkably powerful motivator. It entirely overrides human shame. Patricia wiped her fake tears, her eyes suddenly gleaming with a frantic, sickening level of opportunism. She grabbed Thomas by the sleeve of his tuxedo, yanking him out of his chair. They practically trampled over Mitchell's sobbing form to get out of the booth. They did not run toward the exits. They scrambled directly toward the front of the ballroom, shoving past bewildered tech executives and knocking over a chair in their desperate haste to reach the main stage where I stood. The manic scramble of Thomas and Patricia across the ballroom floor was a grotesque display of unbridled greed. They pushed past a group of stunned venture capitalists, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society decorum. Thomas knocked over a silver champagne bucket in his blind haste, the ice spilling across the imported rugs. Patricia nearly tripped over the hem of her expensive evening gown, her arms outstretched as she sprinted toward the glowing platform where I stood. The wall of 12 corporate litigators at the base of the stage immediately closed ranks. The lead attorney took a decisive step forward, blocking my parents from accessing the stairs. She raised a hand ready to signal the Vanguard Holdings security detail to intercept the chaotic couple. I raised 2 fingers into the harsh glare of the spotlight. The lead attorney saw my gesture and instantly halted, commanding her team to hold the line, but allow my parents to approach the absolute perimeter of the stage. I wanted the entire financial elite gathered in this room to witness the absolute lack of morality that defined my bloodline. Patricia reached the barricade of lawyers, her chest heaving as she gripped the edge of the stage platform. She looked up at me, and the transformation on her face was genuinely sickening to behold. The woman who less than an hour ago had sneered at my unbranded suit and prayed for security to throw me onto the street was now weeping. They were massive theatrical tears completely devoid of actual sorrow, generated entirely by the magnetic pull of my newly revealed net worth. "Quinn, my darling," Patricia cried out, her voice echoing shrilly in the vast ballroom. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. We always knew you were a genius. We always knew you were destined to conquer this industry." I looked down at the woman who gave birth to me. My expression did not shift. I did not blink. I felt a cold, clinical wave of revulsion wash over my skin. The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering. Patricia clamped her hands together in a gesture of pathetic prayer. "Preston tricked us," she wailed, turning her head slightly to ensure the surrounding investors could hear her tragic defense. "That monster manipulated our entire family. He poisoned our minds against our own flesh and blood. He forced us to sign those separation agreements 4 years ago. We are your family, Quinn. We need to stick together and fire these thieves. We will help you purge this company of his toxic influence." Thomas wedged himself next to his wife, aggressively smoothing his wrinkled tuxedo jacket. He cleared his throat, attempting to project the authoritative, patriarchal energy he had used to crush my self-esteem for 3 decades. He puffed out his chest and offered me a wide, sickeningly proud smile. "Your mother is absolutely right, sweetheart," Thomas boomed, projecting his voice toward the silent crowd. "We knew you were playing the long game all along. You inherited my mind for corporate strategy. Vanguard Holdings is an incredible achievement, Quinn. But managing an acquisition of this scale requires seasoned leadership. You need people you can trust in the executive suite. Let your old man step in and help you manage this transition. Blood is thicker than water, my girl." I stared down at them. My own parents. They had watched Preston steal my proprietary machine learning models. They had watched him replace me with Sydney. They had actively participated in my psychological destruction, forcing me to surrender my founder equity just so Thomas could secure a meaningless title on a fraudulent board of directors. They had just thrown their own son Mitchell to the federal authorities without a second thought. And now, standing in the ruins of Preston's criminal empire, they genuinely believed they could pivot their allegiance and claim a piece of my multi-billion-dollar enterprise. They possessed no shame. They possessed no soul. Their love was a purely transactional currency, only deployed when the return on investment was guaranteed. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger or betrayal. Screaming would imply that they still possessed the power to hurt me emotionally. I was far beyond the reach of their toxicity. I was operating with the cold, absolute precision of an apex predator closing its jaws. I placed my hands flat on the edges of the clear acrylic podium. I leaned into the microphone. "You are offering to help me manage my transition, Thomas," I stated, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated ballroom. "You want to offer your seasoned leadership to Vanguard Holdings because blood is thicker than water." "Yes, exactly," Thomas replied eagerly, his eyes lighting up with the delusion of a guaranteed executive salary. "We are a family, Quinn. We protect our own assets." I offered him a slow, terrifying smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth, sharper than a scalpel. I reached down and tapped the screen of my secure tablet. The massive digital displays behind me flashed. The criminal audit logs and offshore wire transfers detailing Preston and Mitchell's federal fraud vanished. A new, highly classified legal document populated the high-definition screens. It was a complex financial instrument, heavily stamped with the official seals of a major international banking institution. The document featured deeply redacted account numbers, but the bold, unmistakable signatures at the bottom of the contract were projected in massive font for the entire room to verify. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the front rows of the audience as the elite venture capitalists processed the horrifying nature of the financial contract displayed above my head. I looked down at the man who had traded his daughter's future for proximity to wealth. "Since we are talking about families sticking together, Dad," I said, letting my voice drop to a deadly absolute calm, "let us talk about your house." The document glowing on the massive digital screens behind me was a masterpiece of absolute unbridled financial desperation. I watched my father look up at the high-definition projection, his eyes tracing the heavily redacted lines of the contract. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. Beside him, Patricia let out a sharp gasp, her perfectly manicured hands flying to cover her mouth as she recognized her own sprawling cursive signature at the bottom of the page. "You spent my entire childhood treating our family estate like it was a royal palace," I stated, my voice projecting across the dead silent ballroom. "You used that house as a weapon. You constantly reminded me that living under your roof was a privilege that could be revoked the second I failed to meet your impossible standards. You hosted extravagant dinner parties to show off your wealth to your country club friends, desperate to maintain the illusion of generational prosperity." I stepped away from the acrylic podium, walking to the very edge of the stage so I could look directly down into my father's terrified eyes. "But true wealth does not panic, Thomas," I said softly, the microphone catching every razor-sharp syllable. "True wealth does not get greedy. 30 days ago, Preston informed you that a massive anonymous conglomerate called Vanguard Holdings was preparing a $50 million buyout of his company. He pitched you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to participate in a secret friends and family funding round right before the acquisition went public. He promised you a tenfold return on your investment." A heavy, judging murmur swept through the front rows of the audience. The elite venture capitalists and hedge fund managers sitting at the VIP tables looked at my parents with profound clinical disgust. In the corporate world, skipping standard due diligence to chase a phantom payout was the ultimate mark of an amateur. My parents had broken every rule of basic finance out of sheer blinding avarice. "You did not have the liquid capital to buy into Preston's fraudulent scheme." I continued, pacing slowly along the barricade of my corporate litigators. "So you bypassed standard banking advisors. You went to a predatory private lending firm. You secretly took out a massive high-interest second mortgage on the family estate. You leveraged the very roof over your heads to secure $2 million in cash. Patricia shook her head wildly, her elaborate updo unraveling as she desperately tried to deny the public exposure of their financial ruin. It was a bridge loan, she cried out, her voice cracking under the weight of her panic. It was a perfectly safe short-term investment strategy. Preston guaranteed the return. We were securing the family legacy. You were feeding a degenerate gambler? I corrected her immediately, my tone offering zero comfort. You wired $2 million directly into Preston's offshore accounts. You did not secure a family legacy, Patricia. You bought a worthless piece of paper from a man who was using your mortgage money to pay off his illegal betting syndicate. Preston, still pinned against the stage wall by my security team, let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He could not even look my parents in the eye. He simply stared at his expensive Italian leather shoes entirely broken. Thomas stepped in front of his wife, throwing his shoulders back in a desperate flailing attempt to reclaim his patriarchal authority. He aggressively adjusted his tuxedo jacket, trying to project the confidence of a seasoned businessman. His brain was working overtime, clinging to the only life raft he could see in this ocean of disaster. "You are being dramatic, Quinn," Thomas declared, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound commanding. "You are trying to scare us, but the math does not lie. The acquisition is happening tonight. You just admitted to everyone in this room that you are the founder of Vanguard Holdings. You are the one executing the buyout." Thomas forced a tight, arrogant smile onto his face, looking around at the audience, as if he had just outsmarted me in front of the entire industry. He pointed a trembling finger up at the stage. "You can try to humiliate us all you want, but we hold preferred equity in this company now." Thomas insisted, his voice growing louder, fueled by a sudden surge of delusional hope. "When Vanguard officially acquires Preston's assets, all preferred shareholders get paid out first. That is basic corporate law. We injected $2 million into the final funding round. So go ahead and take over the company. The buyout clears our mortgage and we get our massive payout regardless of your little temper tantrum." My legal team stood perfectly still, their faces entirely blank, watching a man confidently strap himself into an electric chair. I looked down at my father. He stood there with his chin raised, fully believing his own twisted logic. He actually believed that my multi-billion-dollar enterprise was going to serve as a rescue fund for his catastrophic greed. He believed that the daughter he had abused, discarded, and replaced would be legally obligated to write him a check. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that caused the confident facade on my father's face to instantly shatter. "No, Thomas," I said, my voice dropping to a chilling, absolute calm. "I am not buying it. I am not buying it," I repeated, letting the absolute finality of the statement wash over the grand ballroom. Thomas blinked rapidly. His mind, conditioned to only accept outcomes that benefited his massive ego, fundamentally rejected my words. He shook his head, a desperate, nervous chuckle escaping his throat. "What are you talking about? You are Vanguard Holdings. You just announced the restructuring on stage. You have to buy the company to merge the assets. We have a legally binding contract for our preferred shares." "I did not announce a merger," I corrected, stepping out from behind the clear acrylic podium and walking to the very edge of the stage. "I announced a restructuring. You spent your entire life pretending to be a brilliant business tycoon, Thomas, but you completely failed to understand the most basic hierarchy of corporate finance. You bought preferred equity. You thought that made you invincible." I gestured to the lead attorney standing in the defensive phalanx below me. She gave a sharp, immediate nod and tapped the screen of her encrypted device. The massive digital screens behind me transitioned instantly from the private mortgage contract to a stark, terrifyingly official federal court document. The seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court was projected in brilliant high definition for the entire room to see. "Equity only holds value if the company is solvent," I explained, projecting my voice so every elite investor in the room could hear the brutal financial lesson I was delivering to my father. When a company operates at a massive fraudulent deficit, the power does not belong to the shareholders. The power belongs entirely to the secured creditors. I do not need to acquire Preston's company to control its assets. I already own the debt. Preston let out a pathetic whimpering sound from his corner. He slid slowly down the stage wall until he hit the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He finally understood the inescapable trap he was in. As the majority debt holder I announced delivering the fatal strike 5 minutes ago, my legal team filed the official paperwork, forcing this entire fraudulent enterprise into involuntary Chapter 11 bankruptcy. A collective awe-struck murmur rippled through the audience. The sheer ruthlessness of the maneuver was undeniable. I had not just blocked Preston's payout, I had legally vaporized his entire corporate existence with a single filing. The venture capitalists in the front rows nodded in grim approval, recognizing a flawless, bloodless corporate execution. In a bankruptcy liquidation, I continued staring directly into my father's horrified eyes. Secured debt is prioritized above all else. The company's remaining liquidated assets will barely cover a fraction of the millions Preston owes my firm. By the time the federal courts settle the secured liabilities, there will be absolutely nothing left to distribute to the shareholders. Thomas stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck in the jaw by an invisible force. He bumped into a dining chair, gripping the wooden backrest to keep himself from collapsing. "Your preferred shares are strictly subordinated to my secured debt," I stated, twisting the knife with clinical mathematical precision. "Your equity is completely wiped out. It is worth zero. Your $2 million is gone." The mathematical reality finally breached Patricia's status-obsessed brain. The illusion of her impending wealth, her country club dominance, and her perfect suburban life shattered completely. She let out a blood-curdling shriek that tore through the sophisticated silence of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom. It was not a simple cry of sadness. It was the primal, agonizing wail of a woman watching her absolute worst nightmare materialize in real time. Patricia collapsed to the polished marble floor. Her expensive evening gown pooled around her as she fell heavily to her knees. She grabbed her perfectly styled hair, sobbing hysterically, completely disregarding the hundreds of wealthy executives watching her spectacular public humiliation. Not a single person in the crowd stepped forward to help her up. The investors merely looked down at her, with cold, unsympathetic detachment, stepping back to avoid getting her tears on their imported leather shoes. Thomas did not reach down to comfort his wife. He grabbed his own chest, his fingers curling tightly into the starched fabric of his tuxedo shirt. He gasped for air, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson as sheer panic seized his lungs. "You cannot do this." Thomas wheezed, his voice entirely stripped of all its former patriarchal arrogance. "We are your parents. You cannot leave us with this massive debt. The mortgage, the private lenders, they will take everything we have. We will be ruined. You made a high-risk, unauthorized investment using your primary residence as collateral," I replied, standing tall on the stage, completely untouched by their despair. "You bypassed standard banking regulations to fund a criminal entirely out of your own unhinged greed. You bet your house against my intelligence, Thomas. And you lost." I looked down at the two people who had emotionally tortured me for decades. These were the people who had willingly thrown me to the wolves to secure their own comfort, who had gaslit me into surrendering my life's work, and who had smiled while I was pushed out into the cold. Actions have natural consequences. I delivered my final verdict, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable authority. "The bank forecloses on your house on Monday." Patricia wailed even louder, slamming her fists helplessly against the marble floor. Mitchell sat frozen at the dining table, utterly destroyed, unable to even look at his weeping parents. Sydney was hyperventilating loudly, clutching her diamond ring, as if holding onto a life preserver on a sinking ship. Preston remained a crumpled, defeated mess against the stage wall. The destruction of their toxic, parasitic ecosystem was absolute and irreversible. Then a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the grand ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wailing echoing through the dark streets of Manhattan. Within seconds, the sound amplified, rapidly growing louder and far more urgent as it approached the hotel entrance. The piercing shriek of heavy synchronized sirens cut through the elegant jazz music playing faintly out in the lobby. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Waldorf Astoria, intense flashes of light began to bounce off the surrounding skyscrapers. Brilliant strobing beams of red and blue pierced violently through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the darkened ballroom in a chaotic, rhythmic pulse. The heavy mechanical hum of multiple armored vehicles pulling up to the curb vibrated through the floorboards. The authorities had arrived. The heavy brass-studded doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently breached. A wave of federal agents poured into the room, moving with terrifying synchronized precision. They were a mix of heavily armed Federal Bureau of Investigation operatives in tactical windbreakers and stern-faced investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission carrying thick leather dossiers. The flashing red and blue lights from the street outside perfectly illuminated the silver badges hanging from their necks. The hundreds of elite venture capitalists in the room instantly stepped back, pressing themselves against the silk-draped tables to clear a wide path. Nobody in the financial sector wants to stand in the way of a federal raid. The pristine, sophisticated atmosphere of the Waldorf Astoria was instantly annihilated, replaced by the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled reality of a major criminal takedown. Up on the stage, Preston finally snapped out of his catatonic stupor. The sight of the federal agents breached his paralysis. Pure primitive panic hijacked his nervous system. He scrambled up from the stage floor, his eyes darting wildly across the room. He spotted the swinging wooden doors leading to the catering kitchens on the far left side of the hall. Preston shoved himself away from the wall and bolted. He sprinted across the polished marble, knocking over a tray of crystal champagne flutes held by a stunned waiter. He was desperately trying to escape the inescapable fighting purely on flight or fight instincts. He did not even make it halfway to the kitchen. Two massive FBI agents intercepted him with ruthless efficiency. The lead agent lunged forward, grabbing the collar of Preston's custom velvet jacket and slamming him violently onto the hard marble floor. The impact was sickeningly loud. Preston let out a sharp cry of pain as the wind was knocked completely out of his lungs. The agent pressed a heavy knee directly into the small of Preston's back, pinning the former tech CEO flat against the ground. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed clearly through the silent ballroom. At the center table, Sydney was witnessing the brutal subjugation of her husband. She backed away, her hands clutching her face, a high-pitched wail tearing from her throat. Her escape route was immediately blocked. A female SEC investigator dressed in a sharp gray suit stepped squarely in front of her. The investigator did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. "Remove the jewelry," the investigator ordered, her voice cold and absolute. Sydney shook her head frantically, stepping back until her hips hit the dining table. "No, you cannot do this. My husband bought these for me. They are mine." "Your husband purchased those items using stolen corporate capital and embezzled research funds," the investigator stated, pulling a pair of plastic evidence bags from her jacket pocket. "They are classified as assets purchased with illicit federal funds, and they are being seized for immediate liquidation. Take them off right now, or I will have you arrested for obstruction of justice." Sydney let out a wretched, guttural sob. Her hands were shaking violently as she reached up to unfasten the heavy diamond necklace. It dropped into the plastic evidence bag with a dull thud. Then the investigator pointed a stern finger at Sydney's left hand. "The ring, too." Sydney cried harder, her tears ruining her expensive makeup as she struggled to pull the massive diamond ring off her finger. She finally yanked it free and dropped it into the bag. Stripped of her stolen diamonds and her fabricated wealth, Sydney looked incredibly small, pathetic, and entirely ordinary. A few feet away, my brother Mitchell was attempting his own cowardly escape. He had dropped to his hands and knees, trying to crawl under the tables to blend into the panicked crowd of investors. A federal agent grabbed him by the back of his suit collar and hauled him roughly to his feet. "Mitchell Anderson," the agent barked, spinning my brother around and slamming his hands behind his back. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, unauthorized access to a protected computer system, and acting as a primary accomplice to federal wire fraud." "I did not do anything." Mitchell shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute terror. Preston made me do it. I was just following orders. He told me it was legal. Save it for the judge, the agent replied, slapping the handcuffs onto Mitchell's wrists with a harsh metallic snap. The federal agents hauled Preston up from the floor. His velvet suit was torn at the shoulder, and a thin line of blood trickled from a scrape on his forehead, where he had hit the marble. He looked completely destroyed. His arrogant facade had been violently eradicated. The lead FBI agent stood between Preston and Mitchell. The entire ballroom of elite investors watched in dead, captivated silence as the agent began to recite the words that marked the absolute end of their lives. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent announced, his voice ringing out with grim authority. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." I stood on the stage, looking down at the two men who had conspired to ruin my future. The venture capitalists who had just minutes ago considered Preston a peer, now looked at him like a diseased animal. The tech industry forgives many things, but it never forgives losing its money. They were no longer the golden boys. They were just two common criminals being dragged away to face decades in a federal penitentiary. The justice was absolute, raw, and undeniable. As the agents began to march Preston and Mitchell down the center aisle toward the exit, the remaining members of my toxic bloodline completely shattered. Patricia, who had been kneeling on the floor sobbing since the bankruptcy announcement, suddenly snapped her head up. Her eyes were wild with sheer, unadulterated panic. She watched her golden son being hauled away in handcuffs, and the reality of her impending homelessness finally broke her mind. In a final act of utterly shameless desperation, Patricia scrambled forward on her hands and knees. She crawled past the barricade of my corporate litigators, dragging her expensive evening gown across the spilled champagne and broken glass. She reached the very edge of the stage platform where I was standing. Before my security team could intercept her, Patricia lunged forward. She threw her arms out and tightly grabbed my left ankle, digging her manicured nails into my skin as she stared up at me, with a face twisted in pure terror, begging for mercy. I looked down at the woman clutching my left ankle. Patricia was a portrait of complete and utter destruction. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruining her carefully curated high society makeup. The perfectly tailored evening gown she had purchased specifically for this victory lap was now stained with spilled champagne and dirty floor wax. Her manicured nails dug into my skin through the fabric of my tailored trousers. It was a desperate, frantic grip, the grip of a drowning woman trying to pull her rescuer under the freezing water with her. Around us, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria remained paralyzed in a state of captivated horror. The federal agents were actively marching Preston and my brother toward the freight elevators, their metallic handcuffs catching the flashing red and blue lights from the street outside. But the attention of the elite venture capitalists had shifted entirely to the spectacle unfolding at the base of the main stage. "Where will we go?" "Quinn." Patricia sobbed, her voice cracking as she threw her head back to look up at me. "We have no house. The bank is taking everything. We have no money left. You cannot do this to us. You cannot leave us on the street. We are your parents. We gave you life." Thomas stood several feet away, completely immobilized by the shock of his impending poverty. He did not come to his wife's aid. He did not defend his family. He simply stared blankly at the empty space above the podium where his fraudulent $2 million investment had just vaporized. He was a hollow shell of a man, instantly stripped of his country club memberships, his arrogant lectures, and his stolen wealth. He lacked even the basic courage to beg. The lead corporate attorney stepped forward, reaching out to physically remove Patricia from my leg. I raised my right hand silently, commanding the legal team to hold their position. I did not need physical force to deal with my mother. I did not need security to drag her away. Her own actions were going to be the absolute instrument of her destruction. I calmly reached into the interior pocket of my charcoal suit. I retrieved my phone, unlocking the screen with a steady, unbothered thumb. I opened the messaging application and slowly scrolled to the family group chat. This was the exact same group chat they had used for 4 years to mock my struggles, belittle my career, and celebrate their stolen prosperity. I scrolled past the dozens of messages where they had plotted to secure their wealth while hoping I would remain broken and discarded. I scrolled right to the messages Preston had sent from the VIP lounge just 2 hours ago. The messages my parents had so eagerly validated with their digital approval while I sat in the dark mezzanine. Patricia continued to wail, her tears pooling on the polished marble floor. "We are your blood, Quinn. You have to save us. You have a multi-billion-dollar company. $2 million is nothing to you. Please just pay off the mortgage. We will do anything. We will be a real family again." I leaned down, bringing the microphone on the clear acrylic podium closer to my face. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Hundreds of elite executives, federal agents, and hotel staff watched in absolute suffocating silence. I looked at the glowing screen of my phone, and then I looked directly into Patricia's weeping eyes. "You want to know where you will go, Patricia?" I asked, my voice projecting across the grand hall with crystalline, terrifying clarity. "You are asking me for logistical support after trying to steal my inheritance, after enabling the theft of my intellectual property, and after watching a fraudster steal my company." Patricia nodded frantically, fresh tears spilling over her cheeks as she clung to the fabric of my suit. "Yes, please, Quinn. Tell us what to do. Let me offer you the exact same level of familial support and compassion that you offered me tonight," I stated, my tone devoid of a single ounce of warmth. I looked down at the screen and read their own words back to them, my voice echoing perfectly through the massive speakers. "Why did you not plan better? Try Uber." The absolute finality of the statement hit Patricia like a physical blow to the chest. She let out a wretched, suffocating gasp. The desperate hope completely vanished from her eyes, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of her situation. Her hands lost their strength. Her fingers uncurled from my ankles, sliding uselessly down my shoe to rest on the cold marble floor. The realization was absolute. There would be no mercy. There would be no financial bailout. They had mocked my supposed homelessness, and now they were genuinely facing the absolute reality of the streets. Their greed had orchestrated their own demise, and I was simply refusing to catch them as they fell. I did not offer another word. I did not look back at Thomas. I simply stepped cleanly and deliberately over Patricia's grasping hands. As I moved forward, my elite legal team immediately formed a protective wedge around me. They moved with military precision, their heavy briefcases acting as a physical barricade against the ruins of my former life. Chairman Gregory Hastings fell into step directly at my right shoulder, the architect of Vanguard Holdings and her billionaire proxy walking in perfect synchronization. We marched down the center aisle of the ballroom. The sea of venture capitalists and industry titans parted respectfully, clearing a wide, unobstructed path toward the heavy brass doors. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared to interrupt the exit of the woman who had just executed the most flawless, devastating corporate slaughter in recent history. The men and women in that room were taking mental notes. They knew exactly who held the real power in the tech industry now. As we reached the grand exit, I did not look over my shoulder. I left the toxic remnants of my bloodline exactly where they belonged, crying on the floor, surrounded by federal agents, broken glass, and the ashes of their own monumental greed. I pushed through the heavy doors and walked out into the cool, crisp air of the Manhattan night, leaving the chaos behind me. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the street, but my path forward was perfectly clear. 6 months passed with the rapid, unyielding momentum of justice finally taking its natural course. The fallout from the Waldorf Astoria Gala was not a slow decay. It was a spectacular, high-speed implosion that thoroughly eradicated every toxic element from my life. In the corporate world, memory is notoriously short when it comes to failure, and the financial sector enthusiastically moved on without them. The federal indictments were handed down less than a week after the ballroom raid. The evidence I provided, the encrypted drive Nia secured, the offshore routing numbers, and the falsified revenue projections, constructed an impenetrable wall of guilt. Preston's high-priced defense attorneys, paid with funds the government had not yet managed to freeze, took one look at the digital audit trail and advised him to accept a plea deal. Preston refused. His narcissism could not comprehend defeat. He demanded a trial, genuinely believing his charm could sway a federal judge. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The trial lasted a mere 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Preston was found guilty on all counts of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate espionage. The judge, clearly disgusted by the brazen nature of his financial crimes and his unapologetic arrogance in the courtroom, handed down a brutal sentence. 12 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of all assets to pay restitution. There would be no early parole. His golden boy persona was traded for an orange jumpsuit and a cinderblock cell. Mitchell's dissent was equally absolute, but lacking even the pathetic bravado Preston displayed. He broke almost immediately under federal interrogation. He wept during his deposition, blaming everyone but himself, claiming he was manipulated by Preston and pressured by our parents. The prosecutors did not care about his excuses. They only cared about his signature on the offshore wire transfers. Mitchell accepted a plea deal to avoid a harsher sentence, receiving 5 years in federal prison for his role as an active accomplice. He walked out of the courtroom in handcuffs, a broken man who had sold his sister for a promotion that never existed. The consequences for the rest of my bloodline did not involve prison, but they were perhaps even more devastating to their fragile, status-obsessed egos. The bank foreclosure on the family estate was executed with merciless efficiency on that promised Monday morning. Thomas and Patricia were forced to vacate the sprawling suburban mansion they had used as a weapon of superiority for decades. They lost the manicured lawns, the grand dining room, and the prestigious zip code. Their descent into poverty was swift and absolute. With their $2 million fraudulent investment vaporized in the bankruptcy liquidation, they possessed zero liquid capital. They were forced to rent a cramped, dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The building was notorious for its unreliable heating and persistent roach infestation. The walls were paper-thin, and the view from their single small window was a rusted chain-link fence surrounding an abandoned manufacturing plant. The social exile was far more agonizing for Patricia than the physical poverty. The country club immediately revoked their membership, citing unpaid dues. Their wealthy friends, the same people they had bragged to about their impending $50 million payout, completely blacklisted them. Their phone numbers were blocked. Invitations ceased entirely. When Patricia attempted to attend a local charity luncheon, she was quietly but firmly asked to leave by the event organizers, who wanted no association with a family embroiled in a massive federal fraud scandal. They were utterly isolated, trapped in a tiny, miserable apartment with nothing to do but stare at each other and contemplate the catastrophic reality of their own greed. Sydney's reality check was a brutal collision with the working class. The federal authorities seized everything. The luxury cars, the designer wardrobes, the offshore accounts, and the massive diamond ring were all liquidated to pay the defrauded investors. Sydney was left entirely bankrupt. The woman who had sneered at my unbranded suit, who had mocked my work ethic, and who had gleefully participated in stealing my company, was now forced to survive on minimum wage. I received reports from former industry contacts that Sydney was currently working at a fast fashion retail store in a dying suburban mall. She spent her days folding cheap sweaters and dealing with angry customers, her manicured hands ruined by cardboard boxes and harsh cleaning chemicals. Her high society friends had abandoned her the second the FBI marched into the ballroom. She had hitched her wagon to a thief, and when the ship sank, she went down with the anchor. There was no guilt. There was no lingering sadness. I watched the natural consequences unfold with absolute clinical detachment. They had dug their own graves with enthusiastic greed, and I simply refused to throw them a rope. Meanwhile, Vanguard Holdings thrived. The bankruptcy liquidation allowed me to reacquire the core patents and the proprietary machine learning algorithms at a fraction of their original value. I purged the company of Preston's toxic management structure and rebuilt the technical team with brilliant ethical engineers. The platform expanded rapidly, securing legitimate contracts with major international logistics firms. My wealth grew exponentially, but it was no longer a secret weapon to be hidden in the shadows. It was a tool I wielded openly, reshaping the industry on my terms. I did not spend my time gloating. I did not follow my family's miserable existence. I focused entirely on the future. I had spent 4 years silently sharpening the blade, and now that the execution was complete, I was completely free to build an empire that no one could ever steal again. As winter turned to spring, the final remnants of my past dissolved entirely, leaving behind a clean, pristine foundation. The toxic tumor had been fully excised. I stood perfectly still before the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office in Manhattan. The morning sun crested over the concrete and glass canyons of the financial district, casting long, sharp shadows across the bustling streets far below. From this altitude, the city looked like a perfectly calibrated machine. The yellow cabs were just tiny streaks of color, and the millions of people rushing to their corporate jobs were entirely silent. Up here on the 90th floor, the air was pristine. The environment was meticulously controlled. There was no chaos, no manipulation, and absolutely no room for incompetence. I took a slow sip of my black espresso from a porcelain cup. The rich, bitter taste grounded me in the present moment. Vanguard Holdings had relocated its primary headquarters to this architectural masterpiece, right in the beating heart of the global financial sector. I had designed this office to reflect the exact nature of my business. The walls were constructed of soundproof reinforced glass. The furniture was sleek, modern, and uncompromising. There were no family portraits cluttering my massive mahogany desk. My space was dedicated entirely to vision strategy and ruthless execution. The heavy frosted glass door of my office swung open with a soft hydraulic hiss. I did not need to turn around to know who had just walked in. Only one person in the entire organization possessed the security clearance to enter my private sanctuary unannounced. "Good morning, Quinn," a sharp, confident voice called out. I turned away from the sprawling skyline and smiled. Nia walked across the imported rug carrying two thick leather dossiers. At 34 years old, she was a breathtaking force of nature. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored plum suit that perfectly complemented her dark, flawless skin. Her posture was immaculate. The tense, exhausted demeanor she used to carry while chained to my miserable brother was completely gone. In its place was the radiant, undeniable aura of an apex corporate leader. Nia was no longer just an auditor escaping a toxic marriage. She was the chief operating officer of Vanguard Holdings. I had appointed her to the position the very morning after the ballroom slaughter, knowing with absolute certainty that there was no one else on this earth I trusted more to manage the daily operations of my empire. She possessed a brilliant surgical mind for finance, and her loyalty had been forged in the absolute darkest of trenches. "Good morning, Madam COO," I replied, walking over to join her at the polished marble conference table, occupying the center of the room. "You are in early today." Nia set the dossiers down and gracefully took a seat. "Global markets do not wait for standard business hours," she said, her eyes gleaming with genuine excitement for the work. "I have the final audit reports for the European logistics acquisition. The compliance checks are flawless. Every single asset is accounted for, and the revenue projections are firmly rooted in actual verified data." I took the seat across from her, opening the first dossier. We spent the next hour doing what we did best. We reviewed real, honest business. There were no fabricated user metrics, no offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and no desperate attempts to impress country club socialites. We analyzed market trends, calculated legitimate profit margins, and strategized our next global expansion. The synergy between us was seamless. We did not need to raise our voices or engage in petty power struggles. We simply operated with a foundation of total, uncompromising mutual respect. As we finalized the terms of the acquisition, Nia closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. She picked up her own cup of coffee, letting out a quiet, contented sigh. "It is still almost hard to believe," Nia said softly, looking around the immaculate penthouse suite. The sheer scale of what we are running here. Sometimes I think back to that dark corner of the VIP lounge at the hotel. It feels like an entire lifetime ago. I closed my dossier and folded my hands on the cool marble. It was a different lifetime, Nia. We were entirely different people back then. We were women who were told to shrink ourselves to make weak men feel powerful. Nia offered a slow, knowing nod. Her dark eyes reflected a profound shared understanding. I wasted 4 years trying to find logic in a family that operated purely on delusion and greed, she said. I kept waiting for Mitchell or your parents to show a single ounce of decency. I thought if I was just patient enough, they would eventually do the right thing. They were never going to do the right thing, I replied evenly. Because doing the right thing requires a moral compass they simply do not possess. They viewed loyalty as a transaction. They viewed love as a liability. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. Nia shared absolutely zero biological connection to me. We were bound by nothing more than the legal paperwork of her dissolved marriage to my criminal brother. By all societal conventions, our relationship should have ended the moment she dropped her diamond ring into that champagne glass. But society constantly misunderstands the true definition of family. My blood relatives had watched a thief steal my life's work and happily cheered him on for a taste of the profits. They had gaslit me, degraded me, and attempted to push me out into the cold so they could claim my inheritance. Blood had given me nothing but 30 years of psychological warfare and ultimate betrayal. Nia, on the other hand, had risked her own safety to hand me the encrypted drive that destroyed my enemies. She had stood shoulder to shoulder with me in the shadows when the entire world thought I was a failure. She had chosen to protect me when my own parents had chosen to sell me out. Blood does not make a family. I stated, my voice steady and rich with absolute certainty. Blood is just a random biological accident. It is a roll of the genetic dice. Family is the people who stand with you when the fire gets hot. Family is loyalty, respect, and shared struggle. Family is the person who hands you the weapon when the wolves are closing in. Nia smiled, raising her coffee cup toward me in a silent, deeply meaningful toast. And family is the person who helps you build the castle after the wolves are dead. I raised my cup to meet hers. The gentle clink of the porcelain resonated through the quiet, powerful sanctuary of the executive suite. Nia gathered her documents, her professional demeanor instantly returning to the forefront. I have a strategy meeting with the engineering heads in 10 minutes, she announced, standing up from the marble table. I will have the final contracts for the European merger on your desk by noon. Take your time, I replied. We have the rest of our lives to conquer the market. Nia gave me a brilliant, razor-sharp smile before turning and walking out of the office. The frosted glass doors closed behind her with a soft, definitive click, leaving me alone in the expansive penthouse. I stood up and walked back over to the floor to ceiling windows. The morning sun was fully risen now, bathing the entire city of Manhattan in a brilliant golden light. Far below, the financial district continued its relentless, aggressive pace. But I no longer felt the need to fight for a place in that world. I owned the world. I pressed my palm flat against the cool, thick glass, looking out over the endless skyline of steel and ambition. A deep, profound sense of peace settled into my chest. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for my entire life was completely gone. For decades, I had allowed the expectations of greedy, toxic people to dictate my worth. I had internalized their cruelties and accepted their betrayals because I believed that walking away from blood was a failure. But I knew the truth now. I smiled at the vast, limitless city stretching out below me. I didn't just get revenge. I excised a tumor. I cut out the rotting parasitic infection that had been slowly killing me, and I emerged stronger, sharper, and infinitely more powerful. I am finally completely free. The most profound lesson from Quinn's journey is that we are not obligated to tolerate abuse simply because it comes from blood relatives. Her family used the illusion of love to manipulate and exploit her. However, her ultimate victory wasn't just corporate revenge, it was realizing that true family is chosen. True family is defined by loyalty, respect, and those who stand by you in the darkest moments. Excising toxic people from your life isn't a failure, It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Have you ever had to cut ties to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below.